Picture this: you're walking down a muddy road, the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat curling through the air as the sounds of laughter and clinking tankards grow louder. Up ahead, a lantern swings above a heavy wooden door, its warm glow promising shelter from the chill of the night. This isn't just any stop along the way. It's a medieval inn, a crossroads of the ancient world where merchants haggled over silk and spices, pilgrims swapped tales of distant shrines, and spies whispered secrets over cups of spiced wine. These weren't just places to rest, they were the beating heart of trade, gossip, and intrigue, where the pulse of an entire era could be felt in a single evening. What if I told you that the humble medieval inn was as vital to the flow of ideas and goods as the grandest cathedral or castle? Think about it. While kings waged wars and scholars penned manuscripts, it was the innkeepers who kept the wheels of daily life turning. They fed hungry travelers, stabled exhausted horses, and even acted as unofficial bankers, holding money or goods in trust for merchants passing through. The food served at these tables, whether a simple bowl of stew or a rare spice from the Silk Roads, tells the story of a world slowly knitting itself together, one shared meal at a time. But the real magic of these inns lies in what they concealed as much as what they revealed. Behind their creaking doors, alliances were forged, rebellions plotted, and innovations spread far beyond their places of origin. A new farming technique might travel from one region to another thanks to a chat between farmers over ale, while a piece of gossip about a distant battle could alter the price of wool in markets hundreds of miles away. These were the social media hubs of their day, places where news, fashion, and even disease moved at the speed of a horse's gallop. So grab a seat by the hearth, because we're about to unravel how these unassuming buildings shaped the medieval world in ways you've never imagined. To understand just how crucial these inns were to medieval trade, we have to picture the sprawling web of routes that connected empires. From the Silk Road winding through Asia to the bustling via Regia cutting across Europe, these paths weren't just dirt trails. They were the medieval equivalent of highways, pulsing with merchants hauling everything from Venetian glass to Persian carpets. And just like modern truck stops, inns sprang up at precise intervals, spaced about a day's journey apart. That wasn't by accident, it was calculated. A merchant's most valuable asset wasn't just their goods, it was their horse, and a tired horse meant delayed deliveries, lost profits, or worse, bandits catching up. So inns provided fresh mounts, secure stables, and even veterinarians to keep trade moving smoothly. But their role went far beyond logistics. Imagine a German merchant haggling over Flemish wool in the common room while an Italian banker scribbled notes on a loan. These weren't just transactions, they were the birth of international finance. Inns often doubled as makeshift marketplaces where deals were sealed with handshakes and ale. Some even stored sealed contracts or acted as neutral grounds for disputes. The innkeeper might not have worn a crown, but their influence was immense. They set exchange rates, vouched for strangers' credibility, and sometimes even extended credit to stranded travelers. In an era before banks, trust was currency, and the best inns became trusted institutions. Yet the most fascinating trade wasn't always in goods, it was in ideas. A spice trader from Cairo might share navigational tricks with a Venetian sailor over dinner, while a wandering minstrel spread news of a rebellion that would later ripple through royal courts. Diseases like the Black Death hitchhiked along these routes too, turning inns into unwitting epicenters of pandemics. Every loaf of bread served, every whispered conversation, was a thread in the vast tapestry of medieval globalization. So next time you pass a roadside motel, remember, its medieval ancestor didn't just host guests, it helped weave the modern world. Stepping through the heavy oak door of a medieval inn, the first thing you'd notice was how every inch of space served a purpose. The ground floor wasn't just a tavern, it was the nerve center of the entire operation. A massive hearth dominated one wall, its fire never allowed to die, roasting meats and boiling stews while drying sodden cloaks of rain-soaked travelers. Long trestle tables filled the room, their rough surfaces scarred by countless knives and tankards, designed to be dismantled quickly if the space needed to transform into an impromptu sleeping area. Up a narrow staircase, private chambers, often just partitioned alcoves with straw-stuffed mattresses, catered to wealthier guests willing to pay for privacy, though even these were far from luxurious by today's standards. What truly set these buildings apart was their adaptability. That courtyard buzzing with activity. By day, it held merchants' carts and teams of oxen. By night, it might host traveling performers or become an open-air market. The stables weren't an afterthought but a carefully planned feature, sometimes large enough for 50 horses with dedicated grooms to tend them, and those thick walls and heavy gates. They spoke volumes about the dangers of the road. Some inns near lawless regions even had arrow slits disguised as windows and hidden cellars where valuables could be stashed during raids. The hierarchy of space revealed medieval priorities in stark relief. While nobles might retire to upper chambers, common travelers slept shoulder to shoulder in the hall, their shared experience creating temporary communities. The innkeeper's family typically lived in cramped quarters behind the kitchen, always on call to refill ale or mediate disputes. Every design choice, from the central location of the serving hatch to the placement of the well in the courtyard, was engineered for efficiency. This wasn't architecture for aesthetics, it was architecture shaped by the rhythms of pilgrimage, commerce, and survival. Perhaps most telling were the subtle innovations that spread from inn to inn. The wide overhanging eaves seen in rainy regions kept firewood dry, while Mediterranean inns featured shaded arcades to beat the heat. In mountainous areas, you'd find deep porches for snow removal, and along major trade routes, some inns had specialized storage rooms for delicate goods like glass or wax. These weren't cookie-cutter buildings but living experiments in hospitality, each adapting to its location's unique demands. The blueprint of a medieval inn wasn't just about shelter, it was a physical manifestation of human ingenuity meeting the open road. What made these spaces truly remarkable was how they balanced competing needs. The same thick walls that kept bandits out also trapped heat in winter. The central hall that hosted raucous feasts could become a hospital during plagues or a courtroom for traveling justices. Even the positioning of benches near firelight allowed merchants to inspect goods while keeping an eye on the door. Every architectural choice whispered secrets about medieval life where danger and opportunity walked hand in hand, and where the right design could mean the difference between profit and ruin. The true lifeblood of any medieval inn wasn't its ale or its hearth, it was the people who crossed its threshold. Picture the scene, a silk merchant from Baghdad unwrapping bolts of fabric shimmering with gold thread, while a sunburnt pilgrim from Normandy mends his worn shoes in the corner. Nearby, a group of minstrels tune their lutes, hoping their ballads will earn them a hot meal and a spot by the fire. This was no accident of crowding. It was the deliberate alchemy of the road where social hierarchies blurred out of necessity. Take the merchants, for instance. These weren't just travelers but walking economies. A single Florentine wool trader might carry enough coin to buy a village, yet he'd still share a bench with a farmer hauling turnips to market. Inns became neutral ground where deals transcended language barriers. aided by the universal language of hand gestures and shared wine. Some merchants even kept permanent tab systems with trusted innkeepers, settling debts once a year when accounting ledgers could catch up with their wanderings. Then there were the Pilgrims, instantly recognizable by their badges sewn onto cloak shells for Santiago, crossed keys for Rome. Unlike merchants, many relied on charity, and inns often had a pilgrim's discount or even free broth for those visibly destitute. But don't mistake poverty for irrelevance. These travelers were medieval influencers, spreading news of miracles, heresies, or political unrest from shrine to shrine. A Canterbury-bound nun might share gossip about the king's tax policies that would later spark rebellions in entirely different regions. But the most colorful guests were the vagabonds, the actors, fortune-tellers, and tooth-pullers who paid their way with entertainment. A skilled jongleur could turn an inn's common room into a theater, performing everything from bawdy fabliocs to epic recitations of Roland's Last Stand. Some innkeepers kept secret ledgers of these performers' specialties, knowing a good fire eater or harpist could draw crowds, and more importantly, thirsty patrons. Yet not all were welcome. Innkeepers had a sharp eye for sturdy beggars, those pretending to be pilgrims while avoiding work, and known thieves might find the door barred. Some establishments even posted lists of banned individuals, a medieval version of a no-fly list. The irony, many outlaws simply disguised themselves as respectable merchants, proving that in an inn, identities were as fluid as the wine. What made this mix so extraordinary was how temporary it all was. By dawn, the merchant might be off to Bruges, the pilgrim to Jerusalem, the minstrel to the next village, each carrying fragments of the conversations shared over flickering candlelight. In a world without newspapers or social media, these chance encounters at inns became the threads stitching together the medieval imagination. The scent of freshly baked bread and bubbling stew would have been the first welcome for weary travelers entering a medieval inn. These weren't just meals, they were edible lifelines, carefully crafted to replenish energy after miles of hard travel. At the heart of every menu was bread, dense and dark, made from rye or barley to withstand long storage. A single loaf could be the difference between a traveler collapsing or pushing onward, which is why innkeepers took pride in their ovens. Some even stamped their bread with unique marks, a medieval version of branding to ensure repeat customers. But the real star was the stew, a simmering cauldron of whatever ingredients were cheapest and most abundant. Root vegetables like turnips and onions thickened the broth, while scraps of salted meat or dried fish added protein. What made these stews remarkable wasn't their sophistication but their adaptability. In coastal regions, you might find mussels or herring bobbing in the pot, while inland inns relied on smoked pork or game. This wasn't just cooking, it was resourcefulness distilled into a single bowl. For those with deeper pockets, the options expanded dramatically. A wealthy merchant might feast on venison roasted with honey or a capon stuffed with figs, dishes that showcased the innkeeper's connections to local hunters and orchards. But the ultimate status symbol, spiced wine, infused with cinnamon or cloves, ingredients that had traveled thousands of miles along trade routes. Every sip was a taste of distant markets, proof that even in a rural inn, the world was closer than it seemed. The communal nature of these meals turned dining into a social event. Guests shared trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread used as edible plates, while passing around jugs of ale brewed on site. This wasn't just about saving dishes, it forced interaction. A German trader might dip his bread into the same stew as a French pilgrim, sparking conversations that could lead to shared rides or business deals. The inn's long tables became melting pots where languages, recipes, and even superstitions were exchanged as freely as the salt. regional specialties revealed hidden trade networks. An inn near the Baltic coast might serve peppered herring, its spice betraying ties to Hanseatic merchants, while a stop along the Silk Road could surprise guests with rice flavored with saffron. Even the humblest dishes carried clues. That bowl of pea porridge, the peas likely came from fields fertilized by manure from merchants' horses. Every bite was a reminder that no inn and no meal existed in isolation. What's often overlooked is how these menus adapted to crises. During famine years, inns might stretch grains with ground acorns or serve pottage, so thin it resembled broth. In contrast, harvest seasons brought temporary luxuries: fresh butter, ripe cheeses, or even fruit tarts sweetened with precious honey. The rhythm of these changes painted a vivid picture of medieval life, where abundance and scarcity danced in constant rotation. The drinks told their own stories. Ale was the universal beverage, safer than water and packed with calories, but its quality varied wildly. A savvy traveler knew to ask for small ale, a weaker brew less likely to cause next-day regrets. Meanwhile, mead, fermented from honey, was a rarity reserved for celebrations or very generous hosts. The true surprise: some inns near monasteries served cider or perry, evidence of clandestine trade with monks who perfected fermentation behind cloistered walls. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of these meals is how they shaped modern hospitality. The concept of a daily special traces back to innkeepers serving whatever was seasonal or surplus. Even the practice of offering bread and salt to guests, a symbol of trust, has roots in medieval customs. So the next time you sit down to a hotel breakfast buffet, remember, you're participating in a tradition that once fueled empires, one hearty, unpretentious bite at a time. Behind every thriving medieval inn stood an innkeeper who was equal parts accountant, diplomat, and survivalist. The ledger books of these establishments tell a story of razor-thin margins, where a single bad harvest or bandit attack could wipe out a year's profits. Take something as simple as ale, the lifeblood of any tavern. Brewing required barley, which meant negotiating with local farmers or paying grain taxes to the lord. A shrewd innkeeper might strike a deal to pay in ale rather than coin, turning a portion of their product into a currency that bought goodwill and secured future supplies. Then there were the hidden costs of hospitality. Stabling a horse wasn't just about providing hay, it meant employing grooms to prevent theft, blacksmiths to replace lost shoes, and even guards to patrol the yard after dark. The most successful inns didn't just offer shelter, they created ecosystems. A smart operator might allow a farrier to set up shop in the courtyard in exchange for discounted services, or let a wool merchant display fabrics in the common room to attract wealthier clients. These weren't random arrangements, they were calculated alliances that turned an inn into a one-stop hub for travelers' needs. Royal charters were the golden tickets of the trade. A privileged few inns near major pilgrimage routes or trade crossroads secured licenses from kings or bishops, granting them monopolies on services in their area. In return, they'd pay hefty fees, sometimes a third of their income, but the perks were immense. Chartered inns could demand higher prices, host official messengers, and even collect tolls from passing merchants. Some became de facto banks, holding tax revenues for local authorities. The catch: these innkeepers walked a tightrope, balancing royal expectations with the reality of feeding travelers during lean times. The real genius lay in diversification. A struggling inn near a forest might start selling firewood or charcoal. Another by a river could charge fishermen for drying nets in its courtyard. The most inventive kept multiple revenue streams flowing, renting out storage space for merchants' unsold goods, selling travel permits stamped with their seal, or even leasing pack animals to stranded visitors. Inns near popular shrines capitalized on pilgrims by selling pre-blessed souvenirs or guiding services to nearby holy sites. But profit wasn't just about income, it was about avoiding disaster. A single case of food poisoning could ruin an inn's reputation for generations, so quality control was sacred. Smart keepers sourced meat from trusted butchers, posted cleanliness rules for shared bedding, and kept detailed records of which travelers had outstanding debts. Some even maintained blacklists of troublesome guests, shared secretly between trusted colleagues along the trade routes. The ledger of a 14th century Swiss inn survives, revealing how one family turned their establishment into a dynasty. They bought adjacent land to grow their own barley, married daughters to prosperous merchants to secure trade connections, and most cleverly, offered free stays to skilled craftsmen in exchange for upgrading their facilities. Within decades, they owned half the buildings on their stretch of road. Their secret, understanding that an inn wasn't just a business, it was a living organism that grew or withered based on countless daily decisions. What separated the thriving inns from the failed ones often came down to social capital. The best keepers knew when to forgive a debt to a down-on, his luck merchant who might later bring lucrative caravans. They learned to spot the difference between a penniless pilgrim deserving charity and a con artist working the circuit, and they mastered the art of the subtle upsell, offering a special reserve wine to wealthy guests or convincing wool traders that renting the private loft was worth the extra pennies. The economics of these inns reveal a medieval truth. Success wasn't about grand gestures, but about countless small acts of adaptation. Every loaf of bread priced just right, every stall cleaned promptly to prevent disease, every alliance forged with local suppliers. These were the invisible threads that wove an inn into the fabric of its community. In a world without spreadsheets or marketing firms, the most profitable innkeepers were those who could read people as well as they read their account books. If you wanted to know what was happening in the world beyond your village, there was no Twitter or 24-hour news, just the crowded common room of a bustling inn. Here, information moved at the speed of a traveler's tongue, with every new arrival adding another piece to the ever-shifting puzzle of medieval gossip. Merchants didn't just bring sacks of grain or bolts of cloth. They carried updates on wars, harvests, and plagues, turning each transaction into a chance to exchange intelligence. A trader from Lyon might mention a bridge collapse that would reroute entire caravans for months, while a wandering friar could share rumors of a saint's miracle that would send pilgrims surging toward some remote chapel by dawn. The most valuable news, market prices, a whisper about a bad wheat harvest in Burgundy could send local bakers into a panic, hoarding flour before prices spiked. Savvy merchants paid innkeepers in silver just to sit near well-connected travelers, picking up hints about which ports had surplus wool or where Venetian galleys had unloaded cheap spices. These weren't casual chats, they were high-stakes intelligence gatherings where a single overheard detail might mean the difference between profit and bankruptcy. Some inns even developed coded systems, like hanging certain colored cloths from windows to signal shifts in commodity values to regulars, but not all information was so benign. Pilgrims were walking news agencies, their tales of distant lands filtered through layers of hope and superstition. A returning crusader's exaggerated account of Saracen atrocities could ignite local hatreds, while a jongleur's ballad about a corrupt bishop might fuel peasant unrest. Authorities knew this, which is why many innkeepers secretly worked as ears for the crown, noting who criticized taxes or praised outlawed religious movements. In England, some inns near ports were required to report foreign sailors' conversations, a medieval version of surveillance. The darker side of this information web was how easily it spread panic. An offhand comment about strange fevers in a neighboring town could empty an inn by morning as travelers fled imagined plagues. False rumors about coin debasement sometimes triggered riots when merchants refused local currency. Yet the same networks that amplified fear could also save lives, like when inns near avalanche-prone passes developed systems of horn blasts to warn approaching travelers of danger. What's fascinating is how inns became early centers of fact-checking. Regular patrons, like the same carters who made weekly runs between cities, were trusted as reliable sources, while strangers' tales were met with skepticism. Some innkeepers kept newsbooks where guests could write verified updates, creating crude but effective archives. In busy trade hubs, you might find scribes for hire, ready to pen letters spreading a merchant's news to associates in distant towns for a fee, of course. The legacy of this system lingers in unexpected ways. Modern phrases like "heard it through the grapevine" or "don't shoot the messenger" trace straight back to these medieval hubs of information. And that habit of checking multiple sources before believing a story. Medieval travelers did the same, comparing a merchant's account with a pilgrim's and a minstrel's song before deciding what was true. In a world without printing presses or telegrams, the inn wasn't just a place to sleep. It was the beating heart of the medieval information age. Beneath the warm glow of candlelight and the clatter of tankards, medieval inns hid dangers as real as the comfort they offered. That merchant counting coins at the corner table, he knew bandits might be tracking his movements from the shadows, the boisterous group by the hearth. One wrong word could turn their drinking song into a knife fight. Violence simmered just below the surface, travelers found stabbed in their sleep, wagons looted before dawn, even the occasional body dumped in the straw. When a 14th century German merchant wrote in his journal, "I slept with my dagger in one hand and my purse in the other," he wasn't being dramatic, he was stating basic survival tactics. Innkeepers walked a delicate tightrope between hospitality and security. The smartest built their reputations on safety, employing burly ale tasters who did far more than sample drinks. They broke up fights, screened suspicious newcomers, and patrolled stables where thieves slithered in after dark. Some establishments kept mastiffs chained in courtyards or installed hidden peepholes to monitor guests. One Swiss inn's ledger lists payments to a retired soldier who slept by the door with an axe, while a French tavern famously hung stolen goods recovered from patrons as a warning above the bar. Yet corruption ran both ways. Certain inns near mountain passes were notorious bandit hideouts, where the friendly innkeeper might slip sleeping drafts into drinks before his accomplices stripped travelers bare. Local officials often turned a blind eye for a cut of the profits. Records from English courts reveal cases where sheriffs demanded bribes from innkeepers to overlook unlicensed ale sales, while in Italy, some tax collectors forced inns to host their drinking parties without payment. The line between protector and predator was dangerously thin. Guests developed ingenious precautions. Wealthy travelers carried letters of introduction to vouch for their identity, while pilgrims sewed relics into their cloaks, both as spiritual protection and theft deterrents. Merchants used cipher markings on their trunks that only partners could decode, ensuring swapped goods would be noticed. Some even employed sleep shifts, where companions took turns guarding belongings through the night. The most paranoid went further. A Burgundian wine trader's diary describes hollowed-out walking sticks for hiding gold and false-bottomed saddles that fooled even experienced thieves. The architecture itself betrayed these constant fears. Many inns had separate staircases for wealthy guests to avoid crowded halls, while ground-floor windows were barred or set too high for easy entry. Inns near disputed borders often had secret rooms behind hearths or under floorboards, not just for hiding valuables, but sometimes for smuggling wanted men. A well-preserved inn in Catalonia still shows grooves in its doorframe where a heavy bar could be dropped to seal the entrance against mobs or soldiers. Medical dangers lurked alongside criminal ones. Shared bedding spread lice and fleas, while poorly stored food caused illnesses that could strand travelers for weeks. Wise guests carried their own utensils to avoid. Inn's throat, a catch-all term for infections from dirty trenchers. Some pilgrim guides explicitly warned against eating raw vegetables at dubious establishments, where washed greens might actually be rinsed in contaminated water. Perhaps the most chilling threats were the ones authorities sanctioned. During religious persecutions, some innkeepers were ordered to report heretics passing through. In wartime, neutral inns near borders became spy nests where loose talk could lead to imprisonment. And when plagues struck, inns often became de facto quarantine zones, with healthy travelers sometimes locked inside with the sick to prevent disease spread. Yet amidst all this darkness, most inns thrived because they offered something rarer than safety: trust. The same merchant who slept clutching his dagger might leave his best silk with an innkeeper for safekeeping until his next journey. That's the paradox of these spaces. They were dangerous precisely because they were indispensable. Every candlelit corner held both risk and refuge, proving that even in the Middle Ages, people were willing to gamble for the warmth of human connection. Behind every great medieval inn stood women whose contributions were as vital as the hearth fire itself. While history books often spotlight male innkeepers, records from tax rolls and court cases reveal a surprising truth: widows frequently took the reins after their husbands' deaths, turning grief into shrewd business acumen. Take Marjorie Kemp, a 15th-century Englishwoman who didn't just run an inn. She turned it into a pilgrimage hub, leveraging her connections to clergy and merchants alike. Or consider the case of Dame Alice Keiteler in Ireland, accused of witchcraft but likely persecuted because her thriving inn gave her uncommon financial independence. These weren't exceptions, they were proof that when societal rules loosened out of necessity, women stepped into gaps men couldn't fill. The kitchen was where female influence simmered most visibly. While male cooks dominated elite kitchens, inns relied on women's mastery of bulk cooking, transforming cheap cuts into nourishing stews, stretching grain stores during famines, even brewing ale so consistently good it became a selling point. A German chronicle mentions Mother Hilda, whose spiced wine drew merchants off their planned routes, while French legal records show female cooks suing innkeepers over unpaid wages, proving they weren't just labor but skilled professionals. Their recipes were trade secrets. Some inns became famous for a particular woman's honey cakes or cured meats, turning domestic skills into economic power. For female travelers, inns offered rare safe havens. Pilgrimage accounts like Marjorie Kemp's autobiography describe women banding together in inn chambers, sharing remedies for blistered feet or pooling coins to hire guides. Wealthy widows en route to religious sites often negotiated special contracts, paying extra for private rooms or bringing personal maids to avoid harassment. The real surprise: some inns had women's tables near the hearth, where traveling merchants' wives could discuss business away from male ears. These weren't just seating arrangements, they were silent acknowledgments that women participated in commerce long before history noticed. The most fascinating stories emerge from the shadows of official records. A court case in York reveals a brewer named Johanna who supplied multiple inns, employing her daughters to collect payments, effectively running a medieval distribution network. In Ghent, archaeologists found tokens in an inn's ruins bearing women's names, likely used to track credit for female vendors selling eggs, herbs, or spun yarn to travelers. Even the infamous alewives, depicted in moralistic art as disorderly, were often just women asserting their right to profit from brewing, their scolds' bridles more about silencing competition than punishing actual misconduct. Perhaps the greatest testament to women's influence lies in what didn't happen. Despite church sermons warning against female independence, most communities tolerated, even relied on women running inns because the alternative was abandoned buildings crumbling along vital trade routes. When plague wiped out male heirs, town councils quietly transferred licenses to daughters rather than lose tax revenue. And in a delicious irony, some of the strictest sumptuary laws meant to enforce class distinctions through dress were flouted by innkeepers' wives whose fine wools and silver brooches advertised their establishment success. These women carved power from practicality. A widow might marry her daughter to a cartwright to secure wagon repairs, or take a younger lover not for scandal but because he knew how to negotiate with foreign merchants. Their legacy isn't just in ledgers but in the quiet revolutions they sparked, proving that in the humming common room of a medieval inn, patriarchy could sometimes be checked at the door. The flickering candlelight of a medieval inn might have promised warmth, but it also hid invisible threads of disease woven into every shared cup, every straw-filled mattress, every handshake sealing a deal. These crowded way stations became perfect storm centers for epidemics, where a merchant's cough in the morning could spark a regional outbreak by nightfall. Consider the gruesome math. A single carrier of the Black Death resting at an inn for 3 nights might infect dozens of fellow travelers, each carrying the sickness onward along diverging routes. The very connections that made inns vital, the constant flow of people and goods, also made them deadly. Some innkeepers fought back with proto-public health measures. Records from southern France describe establishments that soaked linens in vinegar, scrubbed tables with lye, or even installed clean air vents based on advice from Arab physicians. A few progressive houses near medical schools segregated sick guests in outbuildings, though more often out of self-interest than altruism. A plague-scarred inn could lose business for years. The smartest operators kept meticulous guest books, noting when and where travelers had come from, creating crude but effective contact tracing systems. During known outbreaks, some refused lodgers from infected regions outright despite the lost income. Yet these efforts were no match for microscopic foes. The Yersinia pestis bacterium, responsible for the Black Death, hitched rides in fleas, nestled in merchants' wool sacks, or rats darting between inn stables. Shared bedding spread lice-carrying typhus, while contaminated well water transmitted dysentery with brutal efficiency. Even healthier options like communal baths, popular at some upscale inns, became stews of infection when proper cleaning lapsed. The irony was cruel. Places designed to sustain life often accelerated death. Societies responded with a mix of ingenuity and desperation. Italian city-states pioneered the first health passports, a document certifying a traveler's origin and health status, inspected at inns before lodging was granted. In England, some villages paid local women to launder all-in linens in boiling water, while German towns near the Baltic installed public bathhouses away from main inns to divert disease risks. The most drastic measures emerged during plagues, when inns near outbreak zones were sometimes burned to the ground, guest records and all, to halt the spread. The psychological toll reshaped travel itself. Pilgrims began carrying personal wooden plague crosses to avoid touching shared holy water fonts at inn chapels. Wealthy merchants invested in folding brass cups that clipped to their belts, refusing to drink from communal vessels. A 15th century French guidebook advised readers to sup quickly, sleep lightly, and depart at first light to minimize exposure, a far cry from the leisurely feasts of earlier eras. What makes this history so haunting is its echoes in modern pandemics. The same trade routes that carried silk and spices also transported suffering, proving that globalization's downsides aren't a new phenomenon. When we see airport quarantine zones or contact tracing apps today, we're witnessing the latest chapter in an ancient struggle, one that began when the first feverish traveler staggered into an inn, unwittingly turning a refuge into a relay station for disaster. The lesson, human connectivity, has always been both our greatest strength and our most vulnerable flank. The common room of a medieval inn was a living tapestry of accents, garments, and customs, a place where a Flemish wool merchant might teach Venetian sailors a drinking song, while a Moorish physician debated medicine with a monk from Burgundy. These weren't just chance encounters, they were spontaneous cultural laboratories where traditions collided and fused. Take something as simple as language. Inns along the Silk Road developed pidgin dialects blending Arabic, Persian, and Italian practical tongues for haggling over spices or arranging camel caravans. A surviving phrasebook from a 14th century Catalan inn includes phrases in Occitan, Greek, and even rudimentary Armenian, proof that communication wasn't just about trade but human connection. Music traveled these routes too. A German minstrel might return from an Italian inn with a new lute technique, while a Spanish troubadour could adapt a Moroccan melody into the next season's hit ballad. The famous Cantigas de Santa Maria, a collection of medieval Galician songs, borrows rhythms from North African and Middle Eastern traditions, likely filtered through inns where musicians exchanged riffs over ale. Even dance forms migrated. The lively estampie, beloved in French courts, may have roots in stomping tavern jigs from English inns where sailors let off steam. Cuisine became a delicious record of these exchanges. That traditional English meat pie, its spiced filling traces back to crusaders tasting Middle Eastern flavors at Levantine inns. The saffron that tinted wealthy Italians' risotto yellow often arrived via Jewish merchants who'd perfected its trade at Alpine way stations. Some inns became culinary bridges, like those in Constantinople, where Byzantine cooks blended Greek olive oil with Turkic yogurt, creating dishes that would later evolve into Ottoman feasts. Fashion trends spread just as quickly. A French noblewoman might spot a Hungarian traveler's embroidered sleeves at an inn and commission her own, unknowingly launching a regional trend. Brightly dyed silks from Lucca, initially reserved for Italian elites, trickled northward when German merchants' wives saw them draped over Venetian traders at Rhine Valley inns. Even practical items like the chaperone, a hooded cloak, morphed from Moorish desert gear to European cold weather wear thanks to in conversations between camel drivers and wool merchants. The most enduring exchanges were intangible. A chess set left behind by a Persian merchant could introduce an entire village to the game. An offhand comment about Arabic numerals at a Lombard inn might inspire an abacus maker to redesign his tools. Some historians argue that the Renaissance itself was seeded in these informal gatherings, where scholars fleeing fallen Constantinople shared classical knowledge with curious patrons over wine. What's often overlooked is how these interactions challenged prejudices. An English farmer who'd heard Saracens described as demons might find himself sharing a trencher with a Syrian doctor, realizing they both worried about harvests and sick children. Jewish moneylenders and Christian knights, normally at odds, could bond over mutual annoyance at a dishonest innkeeper's watered-down ale. The inn's neutral ground forced people to judge by character rather than creed, even if only for one night. The proof of this cultural alchemy lingers in unexpected places. That traditional Christmas pudding, its dried fruits and spices became staples because inns stocked them for wealthy travelers. The melodic scales in a Breton folk song, they likely jumped continents when an Andalusian musician traded tunes for lodging. Even modern hospitality, from the concierge's role borrowed from Byzantine inns to the concept of a house specialty, traces back to these medieval melting pots. So the next time you hear a fusion dish or a cross-cultural collaboration, remember, the world started blending its flavors and ideas not in boardrooms, but in the smoky, vibrant common rooms of medieval inns. Walk into any medieval inn along the Camino de Santiago or the road to Canterbury, and you'd find more than just a roof over your head. You'd step into a space where the sacred and the practical intertwined seamlessly. These weren't merely businesses, they were extensions of the church's mission, offering weary pilgrims a slice of sanctuary on earth. Monasteries often operated the finest inns, their stone walls lined with frescoes of saints, their courtyards echoing with vespers chanted by traveling monks. A pilgrim might pay for his stay not with coin, but by copying scripture in the inn's scriptorium or helping harvest grapes from its vineyards. The line between hostel and holy place blurred until it vanished altogether. The rule of St. Benedict, which commanded monks to receive all guests as Christ himself, transformed hospitality into a spiritual act. At Cluniac inns along the Via Francigena, bread was baked in the shape of crosses to remind guests of their sacred journey, while beds were arranged to face small altars where candles burned through the night. Some establishments even kept relics on display, a fragment of a martyr's bone encased in glass, or a thorn supposedly from Christ's crown. For pilgrims hundreds of miles from home, these tokens offered tangible proof of divine protection. But the church's influence went deeper than symbolism. Bishops issued strict guidelines on innkeeping, threatening excommunication for those who overcharged pilgrims or watered down ale. In England, the Synod of Exeter decreed that every licensed inn must keep a lamp burning before an image of the Virgin Mary, both a spiritual beacon and a practical light for late arrivals. Some dioceses went further, requiring innkeepers to report travelers who blasphemed or skipped Mass, turning these spaces into informal extensions of ecclesiastical authority. The most fascinating accommodations were the hospices run by military orders like the Knights Hospitaller. High in the Alpine passes, these Spartan lodgings provided free shelter, thick wool blankets, and most crucially, teams of scent. Bernard dogs trained to locate travelers buried in snow. A pilgrim waking in one of these stark halls might find his frostbitten feet bandaged by a knight who'd sworn vows of poverty, his meal of black bread and goat cheese blessed by a chaplain fresh from the Crusades. Here, charity wasn't just kindness, it was a sacred duty woven into the fabric of daily life. Yet religion also sparked innovation. Jewish-run inns along the Rhine, though often targets of prejudice, pioneered concepts like fixed pricing and written contracts to avoid misunderstandings with Christian clientele. In Muslim Spain, caravanserais offered separate prayer rooms for different faiths, their courtyards designed so that the calls of muezzins and church bells wouldn't overlap. Even competition had holy roots. Franciscan and Dominican inns vied to outdo each other in cleanliness, each order believing pure surroundings elevated the soul. The legacy of this faith-driven hospitality lingers in subtle ways. Modern hotel amenities like Gideon Bibles or Shabbat kits for Jewish travelers descend directly from medieval customs. That quaint tradition of tipping, it began when pilgrims left coins at shrines in chapels, which keepers eventually repurposed as service rewards. And the very word hospitality shares its root with hospital. a reminder that caring for strangers was once seen as healing the spirit as much as the body. Perhaps the most poignant testament to this era comes from a weathered ledger found in a Swiss monastery inn. Amidst records of ale sales and firewood purchases, one entry stands out, a single line noting that on a freezing December night in 1382, the innkeeper gave his own bed to an elderly pilgrim, sleeping instead on the kitchen floor. No fee was recorded, just a scribbled notation, done for the love of Christ. In that simple act, the true heart of medieval hospitality beats across the centuries. The lawbooks of medieval Europe bristled with rules for innkeepers, revealing a world where hospitality was both a business and a sacred trust. In England, the assize of bread and ale didn't just regulate bakeries, it set strict prices for inn meals and drinks, punishing keepers who dared overcharge pilgrims with fines that could bankrupt them. A 13th-century London case shows a tavern owner locked in the stocks for serving weak ale, his watered-down barrels poured into the gutter as townsfolk jeered. But protection went both ways. Travelers who drew knives over dice games or skipped out on bills might find themselves hauled before a court of pea powder, named for the dusty feet of merchants, a swift justice system operating right in the inn's courtyard, where cases were settled before witnesses could ride away. Some laws bordered on ingenious. Venetian inns near the Rialto had to keep detailed ledgers of guests' belongings, acting as informal insurance against theft. In German towns, innkeepers posted bonds sometimes equivalent to a year's earnings as collateral against cheating travelers. Burgundian law took it further, requiring inns to have a sworn, honesty witness present during major transactions, often the local priest or blacksmith. These weren't just rules, they were the glue holding fragile trust between strangers together. The real surprise, how adaptable this system was. When the Black Death wiped out half of Europe's population, many laws softened overnight. Suddenly, innkeepers in Normandy could charge triple for rooms without penalty, while Florence temporarily suspended its ban on housing lepers, proof that even medieval justice bowed to necessity. By contrast, prosperous times brought bizarrely specific edicts, like a York ordinance forbidding inn cats from stealing merchants' salted fish, or a Parisian rule requiring straw beds to be burned after hosting itchy pilgrims. Dispute records read like medieval trip advisor reviews. A Provençal merchant sued an innkeeper for serving rancid olive oil that turned his bowels to water, while a Flemish weaver won damages after a fight over snoring left him unable to operate his loom. The most revealing cases involve women like the widow Agnes, who successfully argued that a drunken knight's broken promise of marriage had ruined her reputation, costing her future in income. Courts often sided with the vulnerable, suggesting justice wasn't as crude as we assume. What these laws truly reveal is medieval society's deepest anxieties. Statutes banning secret doors in inns speak to fears of sneak thieves, while rules about stabling nobles' horses separately from common pack animals mirror rigid class divisions. Some towns even required inn signs to depict religious scenes, not just for branding, but to remind travelers that God watched their conduct. In an era without police forces, the inn's legal framework became society's first line of defense against chaos, proving that trust, and the rules upholding it, was the rarest and most essential commodity of all. The creaking sign of the Tabard Inn swings in the wind as 29 pilgrims gather in Chaucer's immortal tale, their laughter, rivalries, and secrets spilling into the courtyard like ale from an overfilled tankard. This Southwark Inn wasn't just a setting, it became the stage where medieval society itself seemed to unfold, one story at a time. Literary inns like these did more than shelter travelers. They amplified human drama, offering writers a microcosm of the world where kings and cobblers might collide under a single smoke-blackened roof. Arthurian legends understood the power of these spaces too. The tales of Sir Gawain often unfolded in roadside inns where disguised enchantresses tested knights' virtues, while Merlin himself was said to frequent taverns in disguise, eavesdropping on common folk for political intelligence. These stories resonated because audiences recognized the truth beneath the fantasy. Real inns were indeed places where identities blurred, alliances shifted like shadows, and a chance encounter could alter destinies. Shakespeare later borrowed this tradition, turning Eastcheap's Boar's Head Tavern into Falstaff's riotous playground. The fat knight schemes and lies flourished there precisely because inns were society's blind spots, places where princes could masquerade as peasants and thieves pretend to be gentlemen. Even the architecture served the narrative: hidden staircases for clandestine meetings, cellars for whispered plots, and galleries where listeners could lurk unseen. But the most fascinating literary inns weren't pure fiction. The Mermaid Tavern in London, frequented by Ben Jonson and John Donne, really did host poets' battles where verses flew faster than arrows. Cervantes drew from real Spanish venters when writing Don Quixote's misadventures, those dusty roadside stops where the deluded knight mistook serving girls for noble ladies. The line between reality and imagination thinned at these crossroads as writers bottled the essence of bustling, unpredictable in life into their stories. What made these spaces so irresistible to storytellers? Unlike castles or monasteries, inns forced characters of all classes into intimate proximity. A romance could spark between a merchant's daughter and a penniless minstrel over a shared trencher. A murder mystery gained urgency when suspects were trapped together by a snowstorm. Political thrillers thrived because inns were the medieval internet, where rumors spread faster than horsemen could ride. The legacy lives on. Tolkien's prancing pony in Bree owes its DNA to these medieval archetypes, a place where hobbits and rangers exchange wary glances over foaming mugs. George R.R. Martin's Inn at the Crossroads in Westeros serves the same narrative purpose as its historical counterparts, neutral ground where Lannisters and Starks might grudgingly share a bench. Even Harry Potter's Leaky Cauldron follows the tradition, a liminal space between magical and mundane worlds. Yet the greatest testament to these fictional inns isn't their longevity, it's how accurately they mirrored reality. When Chaucer's Pilgrims trade bawdy jokes or debate morality, we hear echoes of actual conversations that once filled real common rooms. The worn floorboards, the flickering firelight, the mingled scents of sweat and stew, these weren't just set decorations. They were the heartbeat of an era, captured in ink by writers who understood that to step into a medieval inn was to step onto the stage of human comedy itself. By the 16th century, the world was shifting beneath the feet of medieval innkeepers. The very trade routes that had once made their establishments indispensable were now transforming into something new, faster, more organized, and less reliant on the old rhythms of pack animals and weary travelers. Stagecoaches, with their fixed schedules and dedicated relay stations, began crisscrossing Europe, offering speed and predictability that traditional inns couldn't match. Suddenly, a journey that once took weeks could be completed in days, and travelers no longer needed to stop at every village along the way. The stagecoach inns that sprouted along these new routes were a different breed, streamlined, efficient, and built for speed rather than lingering camaraderie. Cities, too, were changing. As urban centers swelled, the cramped streets that had once welcomed travelers with open arms now bristled with suspicion toward outsiders. Wealthy merchants began preferring private residences or exclusive clubs over the raucous common rooms of old, while the growing middle class sought out new types of lodging that promised privacy and refinement. The word hotel entered the lexicon, borrowed from French aristocrats who had turned their mansions into stylish retreats for the elite. These weren't places where you'd share a trencher with a stranger. They were temples of discretion, with separate rooms, locked doors, and servants who knocked before entering. Yet some medieval inns refused to fade quietly. Those situated along pilgrimage routes or near major ports clung to life, sustained by loyal patrons who valued tradition over novelty. The George Inn in Southwark, immortalized by Chaucer's Pilgrims, adapted by catering to theatergoers from Shakespeare's Globe, while Nuremberg's Goldine skiff became a hub for printing presses and the new intellectual class. Others reinvented themselves as coaching inns, expanding their stables to accommodate teams of fresh horses while adding private parlors for discerning guests. The smartest keepers diversified brewing beer on site, hosting markets, or even turning parts of their properties into makeshift theaters or auction houses. The death knell for many came with the rise of national postal systems. Royal couriers no longer needed to rely on random inns for rest. Instead, governments built dedicated post houses staffed by uniformed officials. These weren't just places to sleep, they were nodes in an information superhighway where mail was sorted and fresh riders stood ready at all hours. The old inns, with their creaking floors and irregular service, couldn't compete with this clockwork efficiency. What's fascinating is how the survivors managed to endure. A handful of medieval inns still operating today, like England's Old Trip to Jerusalem or Germany's Rhodes House, did so by becoming living museums, their very antiquity their selling point. Their creaking beams and worn staircases now attract tourists rather than merchants, their former common rooms displaying glass cases of relics instead of hosting boisterous debates. The irony is thick enough to taste. These once vital way stations now thrive precisely because they're relics of a lost world. The decline of medieval inns wasn't just about buildings, it marked the end of an entire philosophy of travel. The modern world prized speed and privacy over the slow, communal journeys of the past. Yet something intangible was lost when strangers stopped breaking bread together in smoky common rooms, when news no longer traveled at the speed of gossip, and when a friendly innkeeper's word was no longer as good as gold. The echoes of that world linger in our love of cozy bed and breakfasts or hostel common rooms, places where, just for a night, we can pretend we're back in an era when the journey mattered as much as the destination. Beneath layers of dirt and time, archaeologists have peeled back the curtain on medieval inns, revealing not just crumbling walls but vibrant stories etched in everyday objects. At a dig near Canterbury, researchers uncovered stacks of worn wooden bowls still bearing knife marks from centuries of shared meals, silent witnesses to countless conversations over steaming stew. Nearby, a child's leather shoe, perfectly preserved in mud, hinted at families traveling together, while a collection of dice carved from bone told tales of rowdy evenings where fortunes changed hands between sips of ale. These aren't just artifacts, they're frozen moments from a world we thought we'd lost. Some of the most revealing discoveries come from the smallest items. A broken comb found in a German inn's courtyard still had strands of hair tangled in its teeth. Analysis revealed lice and even traces of lavender oil, showing how travelers battled pests with whatever remedies they could afford. In France, a stash of counterfeit coins hidden beneath a hearthstone exposed the shadow economy that thrived in these spaces, while a Spanish inn's cellar yielded amphorae coated in resin, evidence that wine preservation techniques crossed Mediterranean trade routes long before modern bottling. Then there are the walls themselves. At an English inn along the Pilgrims' Way, faint scratches on plaster spell out names, prayers, and even crude cartoons. Medieval TripAdvisor reviews in charcoal and knife point. One particularly poignant graffito shows a ship with the words "God Save Us" beside it, likely scrawled by a nervous pilgrim about to cross the channel. In Switzerland, archaeologists found a beam inscribed with a merchant's tally marks, each notch representing a debt owed or paid, turning the very architecture into a ledger of trust. Food waste tells its own story. Middens near these sites are treasure troves of fish bones, fruit pits, and butchered animal remains that rewrite assumptions about medieval diets. A coastal inn in Brittany yielded oyster shells alongside walnut fragments from distant orchards, proving even humble establishments served luxuries. Elsewhere, the absence of certain bones like the delicate feet of songbirds, a delicacy for nobles, silently confirms the social hierarchies at play. Perhaps the most startling revelations come from what wasn't found. The lack of personal items like jewelry or weapons in sleeping areas suggests travelers slept with valuables literally on their persons, while the strategic placement of latrines, often downhill but not too close to wells, speaks to a pragmatic understanding of sanitation long before germ theory. At a famously well-preserved inn near Innsbruck, the absence of any locks on guest room doors hints at a culture where communal trust outweighed privacy concerns. Technology now lets us interrogate these sites in once impossible ways. Soil analysis can detect centuries-old beer spills, revealing which corners of a common room were most popular. 3D reconstructions of hearths show how heat was manipulated for both cooking and social control, keeping certain seats warmer to attract higher-paying guests. Even the humble floor has stories, where patterns in stone thresholds map out centuries of foot traffic, showing where merchants clustered and where lone travelers lingered near exits. These fragments collectively paint a picture far richer than any chronicle. Where documents might list the price of a night's stay, archaeology shows us the straw bedding that scratched a night's flea bites. Account books note wine imports, but residue on a cracked jug tells us it was spiced with ginger from halfway across the world. Each layer of dirt holds contradictions, evidence of both heartwarming generosity and cutthroat deception, of shared laughter and lonely vigils. The medieval inn wasn't just a building. It was a living, breathing crossroads where the mundane and the extraordinary colluded daily, leaving behind clues we're only now learning to read. Step into a sleek modern hotel lobby today, and you'll find a world away from the smoky, straw-strewn floors of a medieval inn, or so it seems. But peel back the layers, and you'll discover that the essence of hospitality hasn't changed as much as we might think. Both spaces exist to solve the same fundamental human needs: shelter, sustenance, and a fleeting sense of belonging in unfamiliar territory, the key difference. Medieval innkeepers relied on hearths and handwritten ledgers, while today's concierges wield digital tablets and keycard systems. Yet beneath the surface, the rhythm of arrival, rest, and departure remains timeless. Consider the social heartbeat of these spaces: a medieval inn's common room, buzzing with merchants haggling and minstrels tuning their lutes, served the same purpose as a modern hotel bar where business travelers network over cocktails. Both are designed to foster connection, whether you're sharing a trencher of stew with a pilgrim or swapping business cards with a stranger at the espresso machine. Even the hierarchy of rooms persists. Where wealthy medieval guests paid extra for private chambers upstairs, today's elite book penthouse suites, while budget travelers still cluster in standardized rooms reminiscent of those shared sleeping halls. Technology, of course, has rewritten the rules of comfort. A medieval traveler might have praised an inn for its clean straw and lack of bedbugs, while modern guests expect thread-count linens and climate control. But the craving for security transcends eras. Those heavy iron locks on medieval indoors, they've evolved into electronic safes and peepholes, yet the underlying fear of theft, of danger remains unchanged. Even the concept of room service has roots in the past. Imagine a 15th century merchant bribing a servant to bring warm wine to his chamber, avoiding the rowdy crowd below. The real shift lies in anonymity. Medieval inns thrived on familiarity. Keepers memorized faces, noted returning guests' preferences, and often served as informal bankers holding valuables for trusted patrons. Today's hotels, with their rotating staff and automated check-ins, prioritize efficiency over personal bonds. But interestingly, boutique hotels now market themselves by reviving that old-world intimacy with artisanal touches like handwritten welcome notes or locally sourced meals, proof that we still long for the human connections those medieval inns mastered. Perhaps the most striking parallel is how both spaces mirror their societies. A medieval inn's lay-out communal tables, centralized hearth, reflected a world where privacy was scarce and survival depended on cooperation. Modern hotels, with their soundproof walls and individual screens, embody our age of curated isolation. Yet both remain crossroads of humanity, places where a backpacker, a CEO, and a family on vacation might pass through the same doors within hours, each leaving invisible traces of their stories behind. The next time you swipe your keycard or adjust a thermostat, take a moment to appreciate the centuries of innovation and the unchanging human desires that brought us from straw pallets to pillow menus. Because whether you're charging your phone by a 4-poster bed or listening to the snores of strangers in a medieval hall, you're participating in an ancient ritual, the restless, hopeful act of finding refuge on the road. Walking through the creaking oak door of the George Inn in London is like stepping into a living time capsule. Nestled near the original site of Chaucer's Tabard Inn, this 14th century survivor boasts the last remaining galleried coaching inn layout in England. Its timber-framed facade, blackened by centuries of coal smoke, still bears the scars of a devastating fire in 1676, while the uneven floorboards slope with the weight of countless footsteps, from Shakespearean actors to Dickensian travelers. Today, you can sip ale in the same courtyard where stagecoaches once clattered in, their passengers spilling out with news from Edinburgh or Paris. The real magic lies in the details, the worn grooves in the staircase banister from generations of hands, the faint etchings of merchant marks on the beams, even the ancient counting ledge where coins were once tallied under candlelight. Venture further afield, and you'll find the Pilgrims' Rest in South Africa, an unexpected medieval transplant nestled in the Mpumalanga Mountains. Built in the 1800s but designed like a 15th century European inn, its stone hearths and rush-seated benches recreate the ambience of a Crusader-era way station. The irony, it served prospectors during the gold rush, proving that the allure of a fireside gathering transcends eras and continents. Guests still report spotting shadows of long-departed miners in the hallways, their whispers blending with the crackle of the fire. For a taste of true monastic hospitality, Austria's St. Peter Stiftskillenarium claims the title of Europe's oldest inn, operating since 803 within the walls of St. Peter's Abbey, its vaulted cellar where barrels of wine once supplied Salzburg's bishops, now hosts diners savoring recipes unchanged since Mozart's time. The Abbey's meticulous records reveal that this was where traveling scholars debated astronomy over roasted venison, and where secret treaties were drafted between feuding nobles under the guise of feasts. Japan's Nishiyama Onsen Keonkan offers an Eastern counterpart, continuously operating since 705. While not an inn in the European sense, its hot spring-fed baths and tatami rooms served a similar purpose for samurai and silk merchants traversing the Tokaido Road. The ledger of guests reads like a who's who of Japanese history, shoguns, poets, even a disguised emperor, all seeking rest in waters that still steam at the same temperature they did during the Heian period. What unites these survivors isn't just age, but adaptation. The Brazen Head in Dublin, founded in 1198, morphed from a Norman-era tavern to a rebel hideout during the 1798 uprising, its hidden tunnels still accessible beneath the modern pub. In Germany, Zur Letzten Instanz, Berlin's oldest inn, dating to 1561, fed Napoleon's troops during their occupation, then became a Soviet officers' club, its menu swapping schnitzel for borscht without missing a beat. The thrill of visiting these places lies in their layered histories. At France's La Couronne in Rouen, where Joan of Arc supposedly dined before her trial, you can still order the same cider and tripe stew served in 1431. Meanwhile, Spain's Parador de Sigüenza, a 12th century fortress inn, lets guests sleep in rooms where knights once prepared for battle, their armor replaced by antique bed frames and Wi-Fi routers. Their endurance defies mere nostalgia. These inns survived plagues, wars, and industrialization because they mastered the art of evolving while holding onto the essence of what made them special. The George Inn transitioned from hosting horse-drawn carriages to welcoming theatregoers from Shakespeare's Globe. Nishiyama Onsen swapped oil lamps for electric lights, but still employs the same family after 46 generations. In an age of disposable architecture, their walls whisper a defiant truth. True hospitality isn't about trends, but about creating spaces where human stories can unfold across centuries. To step inside them isn't just tourism, it's time travel with a pint of ale or a cup of sake as your ticket. The smoky kitchens of medieval inns were far more than just places to fill hungry bellies. They were culinary laboratories where flavors from distant lands collided and merged. Imagine a weary spice trader from Venice sitting down to a steaming bowl of pottage in a London inn, only to discover the cook had tossed in a pinch of black pepper he'd carried across the Alps months earlier. That humble bowl of gruel suddenly became a bridge between continents, its peppery warmth sparking a local craving for flavors that would eventually transform entire regional cuisines. Pottage, the thick vegetable and grain stew found at nearly every inn, tells this story best. In coastal regions, innkeepers tossed in shellfish or salted cod, creating a taste travelers would later seek out inland. The version served along the Rhine might include lentils and smoked pork, while Italian inns thickened theirs with chestnut flour. As pilgrims and merchants carried these variations home, local cooks began experimenting, adding a handful of lentils here, a slab of bacon there, until what started as an inn's practical solution for feeding crowds became a national dish. Meat pies reveal another layer of this culinary alchemy. Sturdy enough to survive days in a saddlebag, these pastry-wrapped meals became the medieval equivalent of fast food. But their fillings acted as edible passports for ingredients. A pie bought at a Canterbury inn might introduce Kentish farmers to raisins from Andalusia, while a Breton cook sampling a Flemish pork and apple pie could return home determined to plant cider apple trees. Some inns near trade hubs became famous for specific pies, like the Dragon's Breath pies sold at a Burgundian inn, their fiery heat coming from Spanish paprika smuggled in via wool merchants. Then there's the tale of mulled wine, the ultimate medieval fusion drink. Innkeepers along the Danube learned from Hungarian travelers to steep wine with honey and meadowsweet, while those near Mediterranean ports adopted Arab techniques of adding citrus peels and cinnamon. The result, a beverage that morphed from region to region, its recipe shifting like the dialects of the guests who carried it home. A German merchant might demand his local tavern replicate the Nordic style he'd tasted in a Stockholm inn, smoked with birch bark and clouded with egg yolks, accidentally launching a new hometown tradition. What's often overlooked is how in standardized measurements in cooking. Without precise scales, many innkeepers used communal vessels, a house bowl for flour, a stable cup for ale, creating accidental consistency. When a merchant's wife tasted exceptional bread at a Lion Inn, the keeper might explain it took 3 bowls of rye to 1 of our well water, measurements she'd later adapt back home. These informal standards helped stabilize regional cooking styles even as ingredients kept evolving. The smartest innkeepers turned food into marketing. A Swiss hostelry near the St. Gotthard Pass became synonymous with walnut-stuffed trout after serving it to a Habsburg duke who raved for weeks. Soon, travelers were veering off their routes just to taste the dish, some carrying live trout in water barrels to replicate it elsewhere. Similarly, an English inn's honey-glazed carrots, originally just a way to use up stale mead, became so coveted that Canterbury's Pilgrims mentioned them in journals, immortalizing a recipe that might have otherwise vanished. This cross-pollination had darker sides too. When the Black Death wiped out half of Europe's population, surviving inns became crucial distribution points for new food survival strategies. Travelers learned from Italian inns to stretch grain with chestnuts, while Eastern European techniques for preserving meat in rendered fat spread west via merchant testimonials over in tables. Even table manners transformed where once entire villages shared a stew pot. Post-plague inns began offering individual wooden trencher bowls, a hygienic innovation that eventually reached private homes. The legacy of these culinary exchanges lingers in dishes we still love today. That comforting chicken pie you order at a pub, its flaky crust descends directly from medieval inns' practice of sealing meat in durable pastry. The mulled cider at Christmas markets, a descendant of the spiced wines that warmed travelers in alpine passes. Even the modern chef's special menu traces back to innkeepers boasting about whatever rare ingredient had arrived with that week's caravans. So the next time you sit down to a meal away from home, remember, you're participating in a ritual that once reshaped continents, one shared bite at a time. Long before glossy travel brochures or bucket lists, the urge to explore was already stirring in the hearts of medieval travelers, not for conquest or trade, but for the sheer joy of discovery and spiritual renewal. Pilgrimages became Europe's first tourism boom, with routes like the Camino de Santiago or the Path to Canterbury drawing everyone from penitent peasants to curiosity-driven nobles. These journeys weren't just religious obligations, they were medieval vacations offering escape from village life and a chance to see the world beyond familiar fields. Inns sprang up like way stations on this spiritual highway, their doors open to anyone with a coin or a compelling story, creating a network that would one day evolve into the modern hospitality industry. What's striking is how closely these pilgrimages mirrored contemporary tourism. Pilgrims collected badges at shrines, the medieval equivalent of souvenir magnets, sewing them onto cloaks to showcase their travels. Guidebooks like the 12th century Codex Calixtinus offered tips on where to eat, which relics were worth seeing, and even warnings about unscrupulous innkeepers watering down wine. Sound familiar? The same impulses that drive us to post-restaurant reviews or hunt for hidden gems animated these early travelers, proving that the desire to document and share experiences is timeless. Inns adapted ingeniously to this new clientele. Along the Via Francigena to Rome, establishments offered pilgrim menus, fixed-price meals of bread, stew, and ale, often served with a side of local lore from chatty keepers. Some even provided pilgrim passports, stamped at each stop to prove completion of the journey, a direct ancestor of today's visa stamps. Clever operators near major shrines upsell relics, replicas, or bottled holy water from nearby springs, turning faith into a thriving cottage industry. The line between devotion and commerce blurred until it vanished altogether, but pilgrimage was just the beginning. As stability returned after the Crusades, a new breed of traveler emerged, the leisured explorer. Wealthy students from Oxford would trek to Paris just to hear a famous scholar lecture, while bored aristocrats toured Mediterranean ruins to collect antiquities. Inns catering to these clients began offering more than just beds. They became cultural hubs, arranging guided tours of local cathedrals or securing invitations to noble estates. A surviving letter from a 15th century German merchant describes paying an innkeeper extra to introduce him to a Florentine art collector, proving that networking holidays aren't a modern invention. The real game changer came from an unexpected source: chivalric romance. Tales of King Arthur and wandering knights sparked a fashion for adventure pilgrimages, where young nobles roamed the countryside in search of jousts and courtly love. Inns along tournament routes thrived, some even building viewing galleries or renting out heraldic gear to attendees. This medieval version of extreme sports tourism reached its peak with the Grand Tour phenomenon, though it would take centuries for that tradition to formalize into the gap years we know today. What's most revealing is how these early travels democratized exploration. A farmer's wife saving for years to visit Rome walked the same roads as a prince, slept under the same smoky rafters, and marveled at the same frescoes. Inns became great equalizers, their common rooms mixing social classes in ways villages never allowed. That egalitarian spirit still lives in modern hostels and backpacker hubs, where CEOs and students bond over shared bunks and bad Wi-Fi. The legacy of these medieval wanderers is everywhere, from UNESCO-protected pilgrimage routes now hiked by secular adventurers to the enduring allure of souvenir collecting. Even our obsession with authentic travel experiences echoes medieval pilgrims seeking unvarnished encounters with the sacred. The next time you check into a boutique hotel or scroll through travel blogs, remember, you're part of a tradition that began when the first weary pilgrim sat down at a rough-hewn table, swapped stories with strangers, and discovered that the journey itself was just as important as the destination. A painted inn in a medieval manuscript was never just a building, it was a mirror held up to society, reflecting everything from divine grace to human frailty. Take the famous tavern scene from a 15th century Book of Hours, where travelers cluster around a table beneath a crooked sign. At first glance, it's a simple meal, but look closer. The innkeeper's wife pours wine with one hand while the other dips into a guest's purse. The artist isn't just depicting theft, he's warning viewers about the moral perils of life on the road. Even the dog gnawing a bone in the corner carries meaning, a symbol of greed nipping at the heels of the unwary. Religious art wielded inns as powerful metaphors. In an altarpiece from Bruges, the Nativity unfolds not in a stable but in a dilapidated roadside inn, its broken roof letting in heavenly light. Here, the inn represents a world too crowded with earthly concerns to make room for the divine, a visual sermon about spiritual preparedness. Conversely, some depictions of the Last Supper borrowed details from contemporary inns, with apostles seated at long trestle tables like weary pilgrims, reminding congregations that sacred moments could unfold amid ordinary hospitality. Secular artworks told darker tales. A series of German woodcuts titled The Dance of Folly shows a grinning fool leading revelers into an inn's gaping maw, its sign creaking like a gallows. The message pleasure could be a trap, and inns, with their free-flowing ale and strangers' whispers, were where virtues went to die. Yet even these cautionary images held contradictions. In one corner of the same woodcut, a young couple exchanges rings by the fire, suggesting that danger and opportunity shared the same hearth. manuscript margins teemed with playful inn scenes that subverted expectations. A knight might be shown losing a joust to a brewer's daughter, or a monk trading his scriptures for a tankard. These weren't just jokes, they punctured the pretensions of the powerful, using the inn's egalitarian space to mock rigid social hierarchies. The most revealing are world upside-down illustrations where innkeepers crown themselves kings and bishops serve ale, a medieval satire of meritocracy gone wild. Pilgrim badges, those mass-produced souvenirs of sacred sites, often depicted inns as waypoints on spiritual journeys. A popular badge from Canterbury showed St. Thomas Becket's martyrdom outside an inn, transforming the building into a witness to history. Other badges humorously portrayed drunk pilgrims toppling into ale barrels, blending devotion with self-deprecating humor. Even these tiny artifacts carried layered meanings, reminders that holiness and humanity were inseparable companions on life's road. The inn's duality made it irresistible to artists. In a Venetian painting of the prodigal son, the wayward youth gambles away his inheritance in a bustling inn, its vibrant colors and lively musicians rendering his downfall seductively beautiful. Meanwhile, a Flemish tapestry of the Good Samaritan sets the pivotal act of mercy not on a lonely road, but in an inn's courtyard, where the wounded man's care becomes a public lesson in compassion. These contrasting depictions reveal a cultural tension. Was the inn a den of vice or a haven of redemption? The answer, as always in medieval art, depended on whose story was being told. Perhaps the most poignant symbols hide in plain sight. Those ubiquitous inn signs, swans, lions, or crowns weren't just branding. In a stained glass window from York, an inn sign morphs into the scales of justice, suggesting that earthly hospitality mirrored divine judgment. Elsewhere, a painted-in door stands ajar, neither fully open nor closed, an apt metaphor for the medieval soul, perpetually poised between salvation and sin. For all their rustic charm, these artistic inns were never simple backdrops. They were stages where the drama of human nature played out in endless variations, inviting viewers to ponder where they themselves might fit in the frame. The raucous laughter and twanging lute strings of a medieval inn's common room didn't just fill the air, they wove an invisible web of connection across a fragmented world. Picture this, a traveling minstrel from Provence tuning his vielle as German merchants slam pewter cups in rhythm, their boisterous chorus drowning out the crackling hearth. Entertainment wasn't just diversion here. It was social glue, a currency as vital as the coins tossed into the musician's hat. These performers were the original influencers, carrying hit songs from Parisian courts to rustic village inns, their ballads stitching together a shared cultural fabric across kingdoms. Jongleurs, the medieval equivalent of one-person variety shows, juggled, recited epic poetry, and even performed acrobatics on tabletops cleared of ale tankards. Their repertoires were as mobile as their audiences. A satire about greedy bishops might kill in Flanders but land them in stocks if performed too near a cathedral town. The smartest adapted on the fly, reading the room like modern comedians testing material. Records from Burgundy mention a performer who kept 3 versions of his act, one for nobles, one for merchants, and a ribald late night set for rowdy students. But the real power players were the storytellers. In an era before printing presses, a gifted narrator could make an inn's reputation. The Mermaid Inn near London became legendary for hosting a blind Irish bard whose rendition of Tristan and Isolde left hardened knights weeping into their wine. These oral historians didn't just entertain, they preserved collective memory. A crusader's exaggerated account of Jerusalem's wonders, spun over ale at a Rhine Valley inn, might inspire the next wave of pilgrims. The tales mutated with each retelling, blending fact and fiction until even local legends took on the sheen of universal truth. Not all amusement met with approval. Dice games in shadowy corners often erupted into brawls, prompting clever innkeepers to install designated gaming tables with iron rings to chain down purses and weapons. Church frescoes from the period depict devils lurking over gambling tables, yet the activity thrived, especially in inns near ports, where sailors blew months of wages in a single night. Some establishments turned vice into virtue. A Swiss inn's ledger notes earnings from renting special dice weighted in the house's favor, while a Catalan tavern employed a retired knight solely to mediate gambling disputes. Dancing posed another paradox. While clerics condemned it as sinful, inn courtyards regularly transformed into impromptu dance floors. A traveler's journal from 1423 describes a Breton inn where locals taught Spanish merchants a circle dance called the farandole, feet stomping, skirts whirling until the bailiff arrived to break it up. The very movement scandalized authorities. Close contact dances like the estampie blurred class lines when nobles clasped hands with cobblers. Yet these spontaneous gatherings birthed regional styles. The precise footwork of Italian tavern dances eventually evolved into the ballet steps of Renaissance courts. Music tuned itself to the space. Lutes and harps suited intimate chambers where aristocrats discussed politics, while bagpipes and drums rallied energy in vast common halls. Songbooks from the period reveal how lyrics adapted to inn life. Drinking songs shortened for rowdy crowds, or romantic ballads rewritten with local place names to flatter audiences. A clever minstrel might improvise verses about a patron's exploits, ensuring generous tips and repeat bookings. The most successful acts became institutions. The famous Three Ravens trio reportedly played the same Franconian in every winter for 30 years, their annual arrival marked on town almanacs. These sonic landscapes did more than amuse, they shaped identities. A merchant hearing a crusade song in a Genos inn might commission armor the next morning. A farmer's daughter, mesmerized by a troubadour's tales of courtly love, could dream beyond her village for the first time. Even the church reluctantly acknowledged this power, allowing carols in inns during Christmas while banning secular tunes in Lent. The vibrations of laughter, music, and clinking glasses didn't just echo off timber beams, they resonated through the collective psyche of an era, proving that sometimes the most profound history is written not in ink, but in the ephemeral joy of a well-sung chorus and the warmth of shared revelry. Every time you check into a hotel or order a drink at a tavern, you're speaking the linguistic legacy of medieval inns without even realizing it. The word hostel comes from the Latin hospitale, meaning a place of welcome, but it was in the bustling common rooms of roadside inns that the term evolved into something more than just shelter. It became a promise of shared humanity. Even tavern traces back to the Latin taberna, originally just a shed or stall, until centuries of travelers transformed it into shorthand for camaraderie and ale-soaked storytelling. These words didn't just survive, they thrived, carried forward by the countless mouths that shaped them over fireside conversations. Consider the phrase room and board. To medieval travelers, this wasn't just a transactional offer, it was life itself. The board referred to the long wooden tables where meals were served, literally the plank you ate from, while room meant safety from the dangers of the road. Inns didn't just provide these essentials, they branded the very concept into language. Today, when we say we've paid for full board on vacation, we're echoing 1,000 forgotten innkeepers who nailed their menus to oak beams. Dialects, too, were forged in these noisy, crowded spaces. A merchant from Cologne might haggle in broken French with a lionized silk trader, their pidgin blending into a local patois. Coastal inns near Dover became linguistic laboratories where English sailors adopted Norse words like skipper from Viking traders, while Italian port inns peppered their speech with Arabic terms like sugar, sukkar, and tariff, tariffa. The most fascinating relics are the trade lingos that emerged like the Franco-German hybrid used by wine merchants in Burgundian inns, or the coded slang of horse dealers in Castilian courtyards, phrases that still linger in regional idioms today. Even insults have pedigree. When a drunk patron was called a lush in a 15th century London tavern, it came from the Old French loche, meaning a lazy drunkard, a label that stuck across oceans and centuries. The term reckoning for a bill began as innkeeper slang, a nod to the moral and financial accounting due at journey's end, and that cheerful toast, cheers. It likely stems from Norman inns where cheer meant face, evolving into a celebration of shared presence. Be of good face. The endurance of these words speaks to the inn's role as a cultural crucible. Unlike courtly Latin or church scripture, the language of inns was democratic, shaped by necessity and repetition. A Lombard banker and a Flemish weaver might not share a native tongue, but in an inn's common room, they'd find common ground in terms like staple for traded goods or trust for credit. These weren't just words, they were tools of survival, polished smooth by generations of use. Modern hospitality still leans on this linguistic inheritance. When a receptionist says, "Do you have a reservation?" they're invoking the Old French reserva, a term coined when inns began keeping parchment ledgers of booked beds. Patron comes from the Latin patronus, but it was medieval inns that softened it into a title for respected regulars. Even the humble inn itself, from the Old English inn, meaning inside, carries the primal comfort of walls against the wild. The true magic lies in how fluidly these terms crossed borders. The German Gasthaus and the English guesthouse share a root in the Proto-Indo-European ghosti, meaning stranger, proof that hospitality's language was universal long before globalization. Next time you unpack in a hotel, listen for the whispers of the past in the words you use. They're not just vocabulary, they're the echoes of 1,000 forgotten voices, still chatting, laughing, and bargaining in the great common room of history. In the flickering torchlight of a medieval inn's common room, the line between keeper and constable often blurred. Innkeepers weren't just purveyors of ale and beds. They were the eyes and ears of local authorities, expected to monitor guests with the vigilance of a sheriff's deputy. A royal decree from 13th century England spelled it out plainly. Any innkeeper who failed to report strangers of evil repute risked losing their license, or worse, a hand for repeated offenses. But this surveillance worked both ways. Travelers knew that sharing a meal with an innkeeper might mean their gossip would reach the ears of the town bailiff by morning. Some inns doubled as informal courthouses, their heavy oak tables transforming into judicial benches when disputes arose. The Court of Pea Powder, named for the dusty feet of traveling merchants, was a brilliant legal innovation. These impromptu tribunals, held right in the inn's courtyard, settled disputes between transient parties before witnesses could scatter along their separate routes. A Flemish cloth merchant cheated by a Genos buyer might find justice dispensed before the supper bell rang, with the innkeeper acting as both witness and enforcer. Records from Burgundy show cases resolved by the simple but effective ale oath, where a sworn statement given over a shared tankard carried the weight of law, the assumption being that no one would risk divine wrath by lying with drink in hand. The smartest innkeepers navigated this dual role with the finesse of diplomats. In busy ports like Southampton, they maintained coded ledgers recording ship arrivals with subtle marks indicating which crews were prone to brawling or smuggling. Along the German trade routes, some kept peace stones by the hearth, flat rocks carved with local bylaws that travelers were required to step over upon entering, symbolically submitting to the rules. But when tensions flared, these same stones could become weapons hurled at troublemakers' heads, proving that medieval justice had a blunt physicality we've since papered over with bureaucracy. The relationship between inns and authority wasn't just about control. It was a delicate economy of favors. A lord might overlook an inn's unlicensed brewing operation in exchange for intelligence on tax-evading merchants. In return, the innkeeper gained protection from bandits or preferential treatment in grain allocations during lean harvests. This mutual back-scratching reached its peak in chartered inns, where kings granted monopolies on services in exchange for housing royal messengers or storing tax revenues. A surviving document from the reign of Edward Roman III reveals one such innkeeper in York who secretly funneled information about Scottish spies to the crown, his reward being exclusive rights to host wool traders, proof that medieval public-private partnerships could be as cutthroat as any modern lobbying effort. What's often overlooked is how these arrangements shaped broader governance. Inns became early testing grounds for concepts we now take for granted. Standardized weights and measures enforced by keepers to prevent cheating, rudimentary sanitation codes to curb disease, even proto-consumer protection laws requiring honest descriptions of ale quality. When a French monastery demanded its affiliated inns mark bread loaves with crosses to guarantee size, they inadvertently birthed the first product branding. The very idea of a license to operate, now universal in business, traces back to medieval town councils inspecting inns for fire hazards and clean bedding. Yet the system had cracks wide enough for a smuggler's cart to roll through. Corrupt innkeepers near the Scottish border ran famed blind inns with hidden cellars for stolen goods, while some Venetian establishments specialized in forging travel papers for a fee. The same courtyard that hosted a pea-powder court by day might shelter a dice game rigged against drunk nobles by night. This tension between order and opportunism made inns microcosms of medieval society itself, never perfectly lawful but functional enough to keep the wheels of commerce turning. Perhaps the most telling legacy is how these practices persist in disguised forms. That hotel receptionist checking your ID today, she's the direct descendant of the innkeeper comparing faces to a sheriff's wanted list. The no cash accepted policy at modern roadside motels, a digital age echo of medieval precautions against counterfeit coins. Even the concept of a safe deposit box began in inns, where iron-bound chests safeguarded merchants' silk samples between journeys. The lesson written in the smoke-blackened rafters of these ancient buildings is clear. Wherever people gather, the dance between security and liberty never truly ends. It just changes partners with the centuries. The crackling fire in a medieval inn's hearth may have warmed weary travelers, but it also devoured forests at an astonishing rate. A single bustling inn could burn through an entire oak tree's worth of firewood in just 2 weeks during winter months, with major trade route establishments maintaining stockpiles that would dwarf modern lumberyards. The demand wasn't just for heating, brewing ale, cooking stews, and even lighting required constant fuel, creating a relentless appetite that reshaped local landscapes. Along the Rhine Valley, records show villages enacting strict quotas on firewood collection as early as the 13th century, with innkeepers given priority access that sometimes sparked tensions with local peasants. This wasn't just about keeping tankards filled. It was an early example of resource competition between commerce and community. Water usage painted another striking ecological picture. A typical inn needed over 200 gallons daily for drinking, cooking, washing, and watering horses drawn from wells that often ran dry in summer months. The smarter establishments became early adopters of rainwater harvesting, with gutters channeling runoff into stone cisterns. A remarkably preserved system at a Burgundian Inn featured layered sand filters to purify water before it reached storage barrels, a medieval predecessor to modern greywater recycling. Meanwhile, coastal inns along the Baltic developed tidal mills to grind grain, harnessing natural rhythms centuries before renewable energy became a buzzword. Waste management presented the ugliest challenges. The same courtyard that hosted lively markets in daylight often became a festering mess by nightfall, with food scraps, animal dung, and human waste accumulating faster than it could be removed. Some urban inns paid gong farmers to haul away refuse under cover of darkness, while rural establishments often relied on composting pits that doubled as breeding grounds for disease. Yet even here, innovation emerged. An inn near Lübeck was found to have a sophisticated drainage system funneling kitchen waste into adjacent vegetable gardens, creating a closed-loop system that would impress modern permaculturists. The construction boom around thriving trade routes left visible scars on the environment. Timber-framed inns required massive oak beams, with some estimates suggesting a single large establishment could consume 60 mature trees. As nearby forests dwindled, builders traveled farther afield, transporting materials along the very trade networks the inns served. This deforestation had cascading effects. Soil erosion changed river courses, while the loss of bird habitats allowed insect populations to surge. Ironically, the same pilgrims who marveled at cathedral spires often didn't connect their cozy overnight stays to the denuded hillsides they'd passed that day. Yet some innkeepers demonstrated remarkable foresight. In the Swiss Alps, certain hostelries maintained tree leases, paying peasants to tend stands of young firs specifically for future repairs. Venetian inns near glass-making districts became early recyclers, melting down broken vessels into new drinking cups. Perhaps most impressively, Cistercian monastery inns in France operated managed fisheries, rotating pond usage to prevent depletion, a system later adopted by secular establishments along busy pilgrimage routes. The parallels to modern sustainability challenges are impossible to ignore. Like today's hotels grappling with single-use plastics, medieval inns faced criticism for disposable wooden trenchers that clogged waterways. The tension between convenience and conservation played out in miniature every time an innkeeper chose between cheap, smoky peat or more expensive but cleaner burning charcoal. Even noise pollution had its medieval counterpart: complaints about rowdy midnight carouses disturbing livestock echo, contemporary debates over tourism's impact on local communities. What makes these historical case studies so valuable is their tangible outcomes. When an inn in Saxony was fined for dumping ale dregs into a trout stream, it began using the waste to fertilize hop fields instead, accidentally creating a prized local beer variant. Another in Catalonia responded to firewood shortages by inventing an early insulated cooking box that slow-cooked stews using minimal fuel. These weren't theoretical green initiatives. They were survival adaptations that balanced profit with planetary limits, proving that sustainability has always been as much about pragmatism as idealism. The ultimate lesson from these medieval entrepreneurs isn't about nostalgia for simpler times. It's about resilience in the face of scarcity. Their best solutions emerged not from top-down decrees, but from the daily necessity of making finite resources stretch further. When we look at their rainwater barrels and coppiced woodlots today, we're seeing more than historical curiosities. We're witnessing the roots of a mindset that could guide us once again, if we're wise enough to recognize its value. Medieval inns were never just wooden structures with beds and ale. They were living, breathing crossroads where the pulse of an entire era could be felt in the clatter of tankards and the murmur of shared stories. Think about the sheer weight of history that passed through their doors: silk from China changing hands over Flemish wool, a monk scribbling down a traveler's account of a Mongol court, a jongleur blending an Arabic melody with a French ballad. These spaces weren't passive backdrops, they were active participants in shaping the medieval world, stitching together distant cultures through the simple act of offering shelter. What's remarkable is how these inns distilled the essence of their time. The same fireplace that warmed a shivering pilgrim also dried ink for contracts that would fund Venetian trade expeditions. The courtyard where merchants haggled over spices might later host a clandestine meeting altering a kingdom's alliances. Even the humblest details, the worn grooves in a stairway from countless footsteps, the soot-blackened beams from years of torchlight, tell a story of resilience and adaptation. These buildings weren't just stops along a journey. They were microcosms of medieval life itself, where the sacred and the scandalous, the local and the global, collided under one roof. Today's airports, train stations, and roadside motels might seem worlds apart, but they fulfill the same primal need. The businessman charging his phone at an airport lounge isn't so different from a medieval merchant warming his hands by an inn's hearth. Both are pausing in the midst of motion, drawing energy before the next leg of the journey. The hostel common room where backpackers swap travel tips echoes the medieval tradition of shared tables and traded gossip. Even our obsession with Wi-Fi mirrors the old hunger for news from distant places. The technology has changed, but the human desire for connection in transit remains timeless. Yet something intangible has been lost in the shift to modern efficiency. The medieval inn forced strangers into conversation, its communal spaces leaving no room for the isolated bubbles we now take for granted. There was no scrolling past each other anonymously. If you wanted news, you had to ask the person beside you. If you needed directions, you relied on the innkeeper's hard-won knowledge of bandit-ridden passes and flooded roads. In an age of algorithms and express check-ins, we've gained convenience but sacrificed the serendipity of those unscripted encounters that once sparked revolutions in thought, trade, and art. The legacy of these inns challenges us to reconsider how we move through the world. When you next find yourself in a bustling transit hub, pause for a moment and imagine the echoes of history beneath the modern surfaces. That coffee kiosk, it's the descendant of the inn's ale barrel. The flight status screen, a digital evolution of the chalkboard where arrivals and departures were scrawled centuries ago. The real magic lies in recognizing that every journey, whether by horseback or jet engine, is part of an unbroken chain of human movement, curiosity, and the eternal search for a place to rest. As we close this journey through time, I'd love to hear where your imagination takes you. Would you sip wine with Marco Polo at a Silk Road caravanserai? Swap tales with Chaucer's Pilgrims at the Tabard Inn? Or perhaps eavesdrop on a group of Renaissance artists debating perspective in a Florentine tavern? Drop your time travel destination in the comments. I read everyone. And if you've enjoyed uncovering these hidden layers of history, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into the past, and share this video with fellow travelers through time. Until our paths cross again, may your curiosity always lead you to fascinating places, both ancient and new.